And my guess is, Glenn, if you did study George Washington, it might not be the more noble aspects of George Washington's life that would be first discovered.
Well, he was a rich white slave owner.
He was indeed that.
Yeah.
He was indeed that. He was also many other things. You know, one of the...
Yeah, he's a guy with white privilege. We didn't establish that, but that's for sure.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you.
Privilege.
Yeah.
And yet, with respect to George Washington, one of my favorite things to show people in the Capitol is the portrait. One of the many paintings that hangs in the Capitol Rotunda is one of George Washington surrendering his commission to the Continental Congress after winning the Revolutionary War. It sends chills down my spine every time I see it, every time I think about it, every time I talk about it. The fact
you don't have to name him, but do you see anyone that is or could be the next George Washington?
Oh, sure. Look, I see a lot of people who have liberty in their veins, who long for liberty, who yearn for it. Anyone who yearns for liberty has the ability to be that person. And all they have to do is speak about it, do something about it, talk about, push back against the narrative that says that anything we do that's important has to be through government, and anything that we do through government that's important must be done through the federal government and never through states and localities. Push back against that narrative, and you will help restore the spirit of America's founding.
You talk about George Mason. You tell the story of George Mason as being kind of a forgotten founder. Tell the story that you have in the book.
George Mason was a remarkable human being. He was a reluctant statesman, one who was a man of business. He just wanted to live his own life without undue interference. He got involved in government. He ended up going to the Constitutional Convention. He ended up having some grave concerns with the Constitution, which he ultimately couldn't support, in part because he could see that the powers created by it would one day be abused. That's one of the things that we have to remember, and one of the understandings we have to restore in this country. We talk a lot in our U.S. history courses in school about the Federalists, about the fact that those pushing the Constitution pointed out that there were all these protections in place. We don't talk as much about the Anti-Federalists, those who warned about how this government power could be abused, those who understood that based on human nature, human beings are by nature redeemable but flawed. And when they get power, they tend to abuse it unless that power is kept in check. George Mason was one who really understood that. And he fought hard to make sure that his fellow beings, his fellow patriots, would be protected. And he didn't want them being subjects.
Wasn't he against the Constitution as written? I mean,
Yes.
Yeah, he stood, but didn't he help write it, didn't he?
Yes. One of his, he was very concerned that unless it outlined more areas that were out of bounds for the government, and unless there were more protections like those ultimately provided through the Bill of Rights.
And those weren't included at the beginning. In fact, every state voted against them.
Those were not included at the beginning. But the Bill of Rights came about in part because of the efforts of men like George Mason, who said, we've got to constrain this government. We've got to identify a number of things that government just cannot do. Otherwise, government will do those things because people will come forward and say, look, this is important, therefore it must be done, and it must be done in the most efficient manner possible.
Mike, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, with an exception of maybe a couple, like the vice president and removal of office of the president and the taxes and prohibition, pretty much everything else in there past the first 10, I feel like are covered by the first 10, and it's just Congress going, no, dummy, what part didn't you understand? Black people are men who are born to be free. Women are, when we said men, we meant everybody. Men, women, we meant everybody. And so it's just kind of a reiteration of the first 10 because they're so well written.
In many respects, yes, and that's one of the things I love about the first 10 amendments is that they're written so carefully, elegantly, and with this simplicity that allows them to stand the test of time.
Right. Except for the quartering of soldiers. I mean, that's the only one.
Well, hey, you never know when that can come in handy.
True.
The day may come, Glenn, when you want to.
What do you think
that.
of the? What do you think of the idea that that in some ways they have quartered soldiers in our home through NSA being able to listen and snoop and record everything that we have. Our government is in our home all the time.
Yes, and in that respect, I've got several chapters in my book that would interest you about that issue. James Otis, for example, would have been very concerned about that. He pushed back on the abuse of writs of assistance, which were these roving warrants, roving commissions that could be used by the king's officers to kick down doors, to go after any contraband goods, pursuant to efforts to enforce laws that were themselves put in place to protect the British subjects in America from counterfeit, non-British approved goods. This is not really a quartering of troops problem that you're describing. It's a Fourth Amendment problem. Mm-hmm. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, in their papers, in their homes from unreasonable, intrusive searches and seizures is what protects us, both in letter and in spirit, from the NSA undertaking surveillance on the American people without a warrant.
It amazes me. There was a new study out that shows that I think it's 49% of conservative millennials say that freedom of speech, freedom of religion, yada, yada, it's all absolute, except the government has to decide what speech is okay. 49% of conservatives think the government has to put limits on speech and press and everything else.
Yeah, and if you understand freedom of speech that way, what you're really saying is there is no such thing as freedom of speech. That's what freedom of speech is there for, is to say government must stay out.
Mike Lee, he'll be joining me soon on the television program at 5 o'clock, The Blaze. You don't want to miss that. Mike Lee, the author of the book, Written Out of History, The Forgotten Founders Who Fought Big Government, Written Out of History, something that should be on everybody's bookshelf. If you're trying to teach history to your kids, it's a great read, easy to read, and stories you've never heard before. Written Out of History by Mike Lee. It's available everywhere right now.